Imagine waking up one morning in one of the poorest countries in South America, where nearly half your neighbors live in poverty, where your best chance at a future is leaving forever. Now imagine that 5 years later, you're living in the richest nation on the continent, wealthier per person than Italy, with $1 trillion literally sitting beneath your feet. This isn't fantasy. This is Guyana, right now. And what's happening there is so extraordinary, so unprecedented, that it's rewriting everything we thought we knew about how nations become wealthy. But here's what makes this story truly fascinating. This isn't just about getting rich. It's about whether getting rich this fast will save Guyana or destroy it. Before we dive deeper into this incredible transformation, if you're enjoying this content, hit that subscribe button. We're on a mission to reach 10,000 subscribers, and your support means everything. Now, let's get back to the most dramatic economic story unfolding anywhere on Earth. The sun rises over Georgetown, Guyana's capital, and something impossible is happening. Where colonial buildings once crumbled in silent decay, construction cranes now pierce the sky. The sound of jackhammers and heavy machinery has replaced the quiet desperation that defined this place for generations. Former street corners where unemployed men gathered now bustle with workers rushing to building sites, driving taxis, unloading cargo from ships that arrive faster than the new ports can handle them. This is economic growth at a speed that shouldn't be possible. In 2022, Guyana's economy exploded by 57.8% in a single year. Not 7%, not 17%, 57.8%. To put this in perspective, that's faster than China during its miracle years, faster than South Korea's explosive rise, faster than any country in the world, and it's not even close. The government has unveiled plans that sound like fever dreams. A massive gas-fired power plant that will slash energy costs, hydroelectric dams to power an industrial revolution, highways cutting through dense rainforests to connect regions that have been isolated since the country's founding, a deep water port to handle the avalanche of global trade that's about to arrive. They're promising free education for everyone, a healthcare system so advanced it will export medical services across South America, and they're projecting that within 5 years, by 2027, Guyana will have a GDP per capita of $35,000, matching Italy, a country with centuries of accumulated wealth. But here's the question that should be echoing in your mind right now. How does a country go from being one of the most broken economies in the Western Hemisphere to potentially the richest in South America in less than a decade? And more importantly, why should we believe this won't end in catastrophe? To understand what's happening now, we need to understand just how spectacularly broken Guyana was, and why that brokenness makes this transformation even more remarkable and dangerous. Guyana's story of poverty doesn't begin with bad luck. It begins with exploitation so systematic, so entrenched, that it became the foundation of the entire economy. When Spanish conquistadors swept through South America in the 1600s, they largely ignored this region. They called it the Wild Coast, a place so worthless it wasn't worth conquering. But the Dutch saw something the Spanish missed. The coastal mudflats and vast river estuaries were perfect for sugar plantations. Sugar meant slaves. Tens of thousands of African slaves were brought in chains every single year. By 1833, over 100,000 slaves worked these plantations, representing 60% of the entire colony's population. Let that sink in. More than half of everyone living in Guyana was enslaved. The entire economic system was built on human bondage. Then Britain took control, and in 1838 abolished slavery throughout its empire. You might think this was liberation, but the plantation owners saw it as a crisis. Their empire of sugar needed workers, and freed slaves understandably wanted nothing to do with the brutal conditions of plantation life. So the owners found a loophole. Indentured servants from India. These workers were offered contracts that sound reasonable on paper. 5 years of labor in exchange for housing, food, and passage to the colony. But in practice, it was slavery with a signature. Between 1838 and 1917, nearly 250,000 Indian workers were shipped to British Guyana under these contracts, creating an ethnic division that would poison Guyana's politics for the next century. Today, you can still see this divide. Indo-Guyanese, descendants of those indentured servants, predominantly work in agriculture in rural areas. Afro-Guyanese, descendants of slaves, make up most of the urban population. This isn't just demographic trivia. This ethnic split would become the fault line that nearly tore the country apart. As the 20th century arrived, Guyana found a new resource to exploit. The world was discovering aluminum, and the ore needed to produce it, bauxite, was buried in massive quantities beneath Guyana's soil. By the 1960s, tiny Guyana had become the 4th largest bauxite producer on Earth. You'd think this would bring prosperity. It didn't. Here's why. Guyana was still a colony. Foreign companies owned everything. They extracted the wealth, shipped it overseas, and left Guyana with nothing but holes in the ground and poverty in the streets. One British company, Booker McConnell, controlled 85% of sugar production, employed 13% of the entire workforce, and pocketed 40% of all foreign currency flowing into Guyana. 2 foreign mining companies, one American and one Canadian, grabbed another 45% of export earnings. Guyana was rich in resources, but its people were drowning in poverty. The wealth was flowing out faster than water through a sieve. After World War II, as colonial empires crumbled across the globe, Guyana saw its chance. In 1953, for the first time, every adult in Guyana could vote. They elected Cheddi Jagan, a man who promised change. But Jagan was seen as too communist, too dangerous. The British suspended the constitution and sent in troops. Democracy lasted months. What happened next set the stage for decades of misery. Jagan's party, the PPP, fractured along ethnic lines. Forbes Burnham emerged as the leader of a rival faction backed by Afro-Guyanese voters. Ethnic riots erupted. Violence became the language of politics. And during the Cold War, when the United States was terrified of communism spreading in its backyard, they threw their support behind Burnham. In 1966, with American backing and an election that was anything but fair, Forbes Burnham took power and led Guyana to independence. But independence was a hollow prize. Guyana was politically free but economically enslaved. Foreign corporations still owned everything that mattered. Burnham looked at his country and saw the brutal truth. Guyana would never develop while foreigners controlled its destiny. So in 1970, he declared Guyana a cooperative socialist republic. The government would require 51% ownership in any business operating in the country. Foreign companies laughed at him. They refused. So Burnham did something drastic. Over the next decade, he nationalized everything. Sugar companies, bauxite mines. 80% of the entire economy came under direct government control. At first, it seemed to work. Global prices for sugar and bauxite were high. Government spending increased. The economy grew. Burnham looked like a visionary, but he wasn't. He was building a house of cards in a hurricane. By the early 1980s, commodity prices collapsed. Sugar and bauxite, the pillars holding up the economy, crumbled. But Burnham refused to admit failure. Instead of cutting spending, he borrowed more. Instead of fixing the root problems, he doubled down. The government now controlled the major industries, but they had driven away the foreign managers and experts who actually knew how to run them. Productivity nosedived. Bauxite production fell. Sugar production fell. Rice production fell. These 3 industries were the economy and they were dying. But Burnham kept spending, kept borrowing, and imposed strict currency controls to prevent financial collapse. It didn't work. The economy entered a death spiral. Between 1976 and 1981, 72,000 people, 1/10 of the entire population, fled Guyana. They weren't leaving for opportunity. They were escaping catastrophe. Government debt mounted to 6 times the GDP. Money that should have gone to schools, hospitals, and roads was diverted to service impossible debts. Infrastructure crumbled. Healthcare collapsed. Education became a joke. Forbes Burnham ruled with near absolute power, and he refused to admit his cooperative republic was a disaster. By the time he died in 1985, he had turned Guyana into an economic wasteland. The late 1980s brought reforms. The government, facing bankruptcy and pressure from all sides, dismantled the socialist economy, privatized state industries, and accepted IMF austerity measures. In 1992, elections deemed fair by international observers brought Chetty Jagan back to power. The same man who had been ousted decades earlier for being too communist now supported democracy and free markets. It was a bitter irony. Guyana avoided total collapse. The economy stabilized and returned to modest growth, but calling this recovery would be generous. What followed was decades of corruption, nepotism, and organized crime. The government, now dominated by Indo-Guyanese politicians, was mired in scandals. 80% of skilled workers left the country because there was no future here. Infrastructure, education, and healthcare continued to rot. Ethnic politics became more toxic. Every election was a battle between Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese factions. Each side convinced the other would destroy them if given power. The political system wasn't serving the people. It was feeding on them. By the mid-2010s, Guyana was the 3rd poorest nation in South America. 40% of the population lived in poverty, and Guyana had achieved something truly horrific. It had the highest suicide rate in the world. People weren't just leaving Guyana. They were giving up on life itself. Nothing suggested this was going to change. Every path forward seemed blocked. Every reform attempt had failed. Guyana seemed destined to remain broken. Then, in 2015, everything changed. After 80 years of speculation and 7 years of drilling exploratory wells into the ocean floor, ExxonMobil made a discovery so massive it defied comprehension. Beneath Guyana's coastal shelf, sitting in deep water just offshore, was an ocean of oil. Not a large oil field, not a significant discovery, an ocean. The numbers are staggering. 11.2 billion barrels of proven reserves. At current prices, that's worth nearly $1 trillion. But here's what makes this discovery truly extraordinary. This single region represents 2/3 of all oil discovered anywhere on Earth over the last 7 years. Guyana went from zero oil to having more new discoveries than almost every other country combined. Production began in late 2019. By 2027, Guyana is projected to produce over 1 million barrels per day. To understand what this means, look at it per capita. Guyana will be producing more oil per person than Saudi Arabia, more than Norway, more than the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait. Countries that have built their entire identities and economies around oil wealth will be dwarfed by this tiny South American nation. The money has already started flowing. Since production began, Guyana's economy has grown by 43.5% one year, then 57.8% the next. These aren't normal numbers. These are numbers that break economic models. By 2027, Guyana's GDP per capita could hit $35,000, matching Italy. The government will receive up to $10 billion per year in oil revenue alone. That's double Guyana's entire economic output in 2019. By 2035, total government revenue from oil could reach $157 billion. Divide that by Guyana's population, and it works out to nearly $200,000 per citizen. This is generational wealth appearing overnight. This is enough money to fix everything that's broken. Build world-class schools. Create a healthcare system that rivals developed nations. Construct infrastructure that connects every corner of the country. Lift every single person out of poverty and into prosperity. But here's the terrifying question. Will they? Because there's a name for what happens when a poor country suddenly discovers massive resource wealth. It's called the resource curse, and it has destroyed nations. Look at Venezuela. Guyana's neighbor has the largest oil reserves on the planet. In the 1950s, Venezuela was the third richest country in the world. Today, it competes with Haiti for being the poorest nation in the Western Hemisphere. Oil didn't save Venezuela, it destroyed it. Here's how the curse works. When oil money floods into a poor country, the local currency surges in value. Imports become cheap. But exports, everything the country produces besides oil, become expensive and uncompetitive. Local industries that aren't directly tied to oil get crushed. They can't compete with cheap foreign goods, so they collapse. As these industries die, the economy becomes dangerously dependent on a single resource: oil. And when oil prices eventually fall, which they always do, the entire economy implodes. But there's something worse than economic dependence. The resource curse corrupts governments. Weak institutions, already struggling with corruption and inefficiency, suddenly have access to unimaginable wealth. Politicians who spent careers fighting over scraps now control billions. The temptation isn't just strong, it's overwhelming. Money that should build schools ends up in offshore accounts. Contracts for infrastructure projects go to cronies and family members. The sovereign wealth fund that's supposed to protect the nation's future becomes a slush fund for political elites. And the people, the ones who should benefit from this windfall, watch as their resource wealth is stolen right in front of them. This has happened over and over across the developing world. Nigeria, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, resource-rich, desperately poor. The pattern is so consistent it's almost a law of economics. So the question isn't whether Guyana will get rich. The money is already there. The question is whether Guyana's people will get rich, or whether this oil wealth will tear the country apart. Guyana knows the danger. They've watched Venezuela's collapse in real time for decades. And to their credit, they're trying to do things differently. First, they're focusing on productive investments. They're not just spending money, they're investing in human capital. The entire education system is being overhauled, with a promise to make it completely free. They're building a healthcare system so advanced that Guyana plans to export medical services across the region, bringing in foreign currency while improving the health of their own citizens. Infrastructure is getting massive attention. Guyana is covered 87% by dense rainforest, which makes building roads and maintaining them incredibly expensive. But with oil money, they're planning a highway network that will connect remote regions and neighboring countries, reducing transport costs and boosting economic competitiveness. A new deep water port will handle the cargo ships that are already arriving in growing numbers. But the most critical investment is in energy. Guyana is building hydroelectric plants, solar farms, and a 300-megawatt gas-fired power plant. By using its own natural gas from oil production, Guyana can slash energy prices, making manufacturing viable. Cheap energy is the foundation of industrial development. If Guyana can provide reliable, affordable power, it can attract factories and create jobs beyond the oil sector. There's also a push to make Guyana a service economy hub, specializing in call centers and IT services. Guyana has a unique advantage here. It's the only English-speaking nation in South America, giving it access to the massive North American market for outsourced services. All of these plans sound promising, but the most important decision Guyana has made is establishing a sovereign wealth fund with strict rules on spending and saving. Every dollar of oil revenue goes into this fund, and there are rigid guardrails on how much can be withdrawn each year. The goal is to prevent too much money flooding the economy too fast, which would cause the currency to hyperinflate and kill other industries. The fund also protects against short-term swings in oil prices. And critically, it's supposed to save money for future generations, so that Guyana's grandchildren benefit from this oil wealth. not just the current generation. If this works, Guyana won't become another Venezuela. It could become another Norway, a country that discovered oil and used it to build one of the most prosperous, equal societies on Earth. But there's a massive problem. All of this depends on Guyana's political institutions holding together under the weight of $1 trillion. And Guyana's political system is fragile. It's been defined by ethnic division and corruption for its entire existence. The current government, led by President Irfan Ali, has already shown signs of the old patterns. They've funneled money into money-losing state-owned sugar plantations, not because it makes economic sense, but because it buys votes from Indo-Guyanese communities. The Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is supposed to be transparent and accountable, has been criticized for lacking oversight. There are fears it could become a vehicle for hidden corruption. And Guyana's legal system, its property rights, its enforcement of contracts, all of these institutions are weak. Foreign investors are willing to pour money into oil extraction because the profits are enormous and guaranteed. But investing in other sectors, that's riskier because the rule of law is uncertain. There's also a brutal time pressure that most people don't talk about. Global oil consumption is projected to peak within the next decade. After that, demand will decline as the world transitions to renewable energy. Guyana has a narrow window to extract as much oil as possible, sell it at high prices, and use that money to diversify its economy before the oil age ends. They need to get rich fast, invest wisely, build strong institutions, and resist the corruption that has destroyed every similar country. All at the same time, under intense time pressure, with a history of failure. It's an almost impossible challenge. So what happens next? In one future, Guyana succeeds. The government invests the oil money wisely. Infrastructure transforms the country. Education produces a skilled workforce. Healthcare makes the population healthier and more productive. The Sovereign Wealth Fund grows into a massive nest egg that provides for generations. Ethnic tensions ease as prosperity lifts everyone. And by 2035, Guyana isn't just the richest country in South America. It's a model for how resource wealth can be used to build a better society. In another future, Guyana fails. The oil money corrupts the government beyond repair. Politicians steal billions while the people watch. The currency hyperinflates, killing every industry that isn't oil. Ethnic tensions explode into violence as different groups fight over the wealth. And when oil prices eventually fall, or when global demand declines, Guyana collapses into chaos, poorer than it started, with nothing to show for $1 trillion except regret. Right now, both futures are possible. Guyana is standing at a crossroads that will define not just the next 5 years, but the next century. The oil is there. The money is flowing. The plans have been made. The only question left is whether Guyana's institutions, its leaders, and its people can resist the curse that has destroyed so many nations before them. Because getting rich isn't the hard part. Staying rich and ensuring that wealth actually improves lives rather than destroying them, that's the real test. Guyana's name means land of water, but as it becomes the land of oil, we're about to find out if sudden, overwhelming wealth is a blessing or a curse. And the answer won't just determine Guyana's fate. It will rewrite what we believe is possible when a nation discovers that $1 trillion has been sitting beneath them all along. The clock is ticking, the oil is pumping, and the world is watching to see if Guyana can do what almost no other nation has managed: turn a resource curse into a resource miracle. We'll know the answer soon enough.